The market, of course, rallied substantially in the early part of 1930. One could read the New York Times and Wall Street Journal from every day of sort of mid-1929 to mid-1930, as I have, and see very little indication that people thought that the world was coming to an end or that there was no trust any longer in the markets. What happened, of course, is by mid-1930, the depth of the economic downturn that had begun in mid-1929 had started to become apparent. Job losses began, overall declines in economic activity began, and not surprisingly, the stock market began to react to the economic news. So I think I would just maybe challenge the sort of conventional account of what happened in 1929.
Well, I do agree with much of what you said, and I think this does provide another opportunity, as we had in the 1930s, to really rethink the regulatory regime. And what we do have now is a very fragmented, bifurcated system that does not match how the regulated entities operate. It also leads to enormous amounts of regulatory arbitrage, as you've got all sorts of convergence of products and services that are regulated in different ways only because of the historical precedents. You know, with financial engineering, you now have products that really throw off sort of the same economic benefits, but that are regulated in vastly different ways, only by virtue of their labels. And I do think that, to a large extent, the success of our market is due to investor confidence that derived from what was viewed as a good regulatory oversight framework. People really didn't feel that they were, you know, at risk every time they entered the market. They felt that there was a regime in place that led to integrity in the markets. And this is an opportunity to, you know, given what obviously is, you know, a crisis in the markets, and I do think there is some, you know, crisis in investor confidence, we could use this as the opportunity to take this to the next level. Unfortunately, you know, the dumbing down way of doing that is to just look at what, you know, all the things that you think went wrong the last time, take the lessons learned in the most, you know, narrow sense, and just add more regulations to it. I mean, that unfortunately, I think, is what's happening. Instead of saying, you know what, be patient, we're going to really try to get this right this time and rethink it. What we're doing is just sort of going, you know, topic by topic and adding onto the system. And in fact, what I find so remarkable is we're adding so much to it that now we need additional counsels, you know, who are going to negotiate among all these new entities to figure out who's in charge, who gets, you know, who gets to decide how this is going to be done. It just doesn't strike me as the appropriate way to go about it.
Are any of the current pending proposals useful or valuable in the larger picture toward resolving the most recent crisis?
Oh, I think there are, well, I mean, there are issues around all of the current proposals. As you can imagine, and as I was saying to Paul earlier, you know, we haven't seen it all yet, because now that it goes back to the floor for additional debate, we'll get sort of a Christmas tree ornaments of added to what we're seeing there currently. But certainly, you know, issues such as, you know, regulation of the derivatives market generally certainly makes sense. Again, we can debate over exactly how they're going about it and all the provisions, but there are areas that, you know, regulation of hedge funds to some extent, obviously, you know, we have whole, you know, pockets of the financial markets that have been sort of there's been less oversight of it. They've been sort of the dark corners. I think we need to sort of consider all of these activities together. So, yeah, I think there are things that definitely are of some value, for sure. But you know, again, I think that overall there are opportunities that are being lost in this debate.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Briard. I'm not only the chair of the Federalist Society chapter in Paris, but I am an attorney before the French Supreme Court, and also I do practice before the EU Supreme Court. Court of Luxembourg. And I had a question for Paul, maybe, and to Judge Jones about the issue of confidence in the market. And I was extremely pleased to hear about that. And what I'm going to say, as you know, is coming from the best friend of the United States. But from a European point of view, the issue of confidence is extremely, to me, I think, is extremely sensitive, extremely important. And one of the components of confidence, I think, is confidence in the regulators, in the federal agencies, seen from abroad. And among these components, there's the issue of the liability of these agencies. And, well, I had to deal recently with the Madoff thing. And I wanted to ask you whether the American case law, the American jurisprudence, could move, maybe a bit different, on the issue of the liability of the agencies, the issue of sovereign immunity and all these things. Thank you.
Yep. Well, I cannot see with trillions of dollars of deficits. I can't see Congress subjecting the taxpayers, basically, under the Federal Tort Claims Act or whatever, to waive sovereign immunity in a case like this. The SEC, clearly messed up on the Madoff thing, and that was, I think, a lot to do with management. Basically at the agency of the Enforcement Division and the examiners. And so that's a tragic result, because I think they were driven, the Enforcement Division was driven too much by chasing headlines rather than actually doing the daily focusing on their job. There are too many staff attorneys told me and my counsel that they were actively discouraged from going after Ponzi schemes and pumping up schemes. Why? Because they weren't seen to yield a big headline in the newspaper that the senior folks could put down on their resume as having brought some big case against Bank of America, for example. Just take one where Judge Rakoff in New York had basically called the SEC out in much more harsh terms than I've ever used. So that was, so I think that's part of the problem. But whether, the government would ever then take on to itself that sort of liability, I really doubt. FINRA, you could look at FINRA as well. They missed Madoff even arguably worse than the SEC, because this sort of thing was clearly within their jurisdiction, and they were in to Madoff, every year doing their exams. But FINRA has its own particular sets of issues. But so I think there's enough blame to go around, and then we can't leave the investors out too. There were lots of red flags for investors. Just looking at the accounting firm of Madoff, a one-person firm, you just had to ask a couple of questions, and many people did and refused to invest. So I think there's a lot of blame to go around.
Thank you. I think we have time for another question or two, maybe. What? Oh, whatever. That's fine.
Brad Smith from Michigan. My question follows up directly on the last gentleman's on the confidence in the system, and also follows up on something that Hank Greenberg said yesterday, the former chairman of AIG. He's proposing that Congress somehow authorize or impanel a blue ribbon commission to investigate what happened in the bailout of AIG. Because he said that prior to the bailout, AIG had negotiated a 40% reduction, 60 cents on the dollar for the collateralized debt obligations that AIG held with counterparties. And suddenly he meets with Hank Paulson, and I understand Goldman Sachs is implicated in a lot of these counterparty productions, and suddenly these counterparties are paid 100 cents on the dollar. So my question is like, who regulates the regulators? Would a blue ribbon commission investigating what happened with AIG inspire greater confidence in the regulators or less confidence?